Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Simon Hodgkins, and you know, it's a real pleasure to be joined by Sietze Rademaker. Sietze, you're very welcome to the show. Let's start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your voice and audio background, because we're going to get into an interesting topic here today. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the kind of work that you do.
So I'm Sietze Rademaker. I started off my career actually studying law. And that didn't go very well, as in I didn't like that part of business. It was very much an elbow, me first business. And I wanted to get into music as I played drums a lot back in the day. And then through a friend, I got to work at Massive Music, which is one of the global big ones when it comes to audio production for advertising and sonic branding as well. And then through that job, where I did publishing mostly and massive talent. Through that job, I met the then MD of Spotify, which was 2009, and I told him that whenever they wanted to start an office in Holland, in the Netherlands, they should call me, and he actually did 3 months later. And then together with two other guys, we basically set up the office for Benelux, so for Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. That included doing everything from getting indie labels on board to marketing, to doing your own parties, to making sure that the Spotify free version had campaigns running on it, so media companies. I did that for 4 years. Then I went off to Vice, which was a very different job where there was not a lot of music involved, but more the Gen Z audience, which was very interesting as well. But not so much with music. So I wanted to get back into music. Ended up moving to Epidemic Sound, now one of the largest rights-free music, so to say, that is used for YouTube, for TikTok, for Instagram, by influencers, by video makers, by companies, by YouTubers, by you name it. They have a large and a very good library that is used everywhere in the world, basically. And so from there, I moved back into more the specialized type of music, which is sonic branding, from jobs at AMP Amsterdam to CGM Song, where I freelanced as well, to now Sonic Minds, a Copenhagen-based sonic branding agency. And I kept believing in that it was an underutilized tool in the set of branding tools that brands have. So that's why, I still believe that it's up and coming. It's not used by every brand. So here we are.
Thanks for giving us the context, because it's all going to be very relevant when we start talking about our next topic. But Massive Music, you mentioned first of all when you moved from law, and that's a huge organization. But you also mentioned quite a lot of brands there, including Epidemic and Spotify, who I know very well, and of course the great work that you're doing working with Sonic Minds too. So let's move it on a little bit. Let's talk about sonic branding, if I can, because I've been
Yes.
fortunate to work for a couple of companies where we've used sonic branding, I think, relatively well, but it's still not used by a lot of companies. Can we start maybe with a bit of an explainer? Tell us about sonic branding. What is it? Why is it important?
It's a strategic use of music and sound for a brand, by a brand, to connect with your audience, with your target audience, in a way that visual does as well. Most brands have a visual identity, color, logo, fonts, that type of thing. And they're very strict in how to use it and where to use it. But a lot of brands don't know yet or don't utilize music and sound to their advantage in terms of as a branding tool. And that means consistent use over all touch points, basically. So they use music and they use sound in their communication, but most of the time it's campaign related and it's not related to the brand value, so to say. So it's underutilized basically as a branding tool. And I think that's the best explanation, is that it's the strategic use of music and sound by a brand to connect with your target audience. Yeah.
No, perfect. Yeah. And interestingly as well, because of the brands that you've worked with in the past and today, um, you were on the ground, for example, you were telling about Spotify, setting it up from scratch and bringing all these different things together.
Mhm.
But of course, now when we think of Spotify today, it's this huge organization. It's
Yeah.
global in its nature. It appeals to lots of people. What about the global aspects of sonic branding? Because does sonic branding have to be localized? Does it have to think about the culture, the audience? How is that sonic branding going to work across the world for a company?
Yeah, it depends. Obviously, some companies have global presence. A lot of companies, local companies, don't have that, so they don't need to localize that. But if it's a global company, it makes sense, obviously, when you're talking about sound and about sound logo and music to make it culturally relevant in the area where you use it. So if you're targeting an audience in Asia, you might want to use different music, or at least music that is strategically used, but that speaks to that audience there. And that could be very different. It could use different instrumentation. It could use different tempo, different, different everything, different like instruments, so to say. But it's still important that it's all part of a bigger strategic thought about music. So as long as you have that strategic use, you can locally change it into something that speaks to that audience in that part of the world. But it makes sense to do that. It's not always good to keep the sound logo could be the same, but musically speaking, it's important to localize it a lot of times, especially for big global brands, definitely.
Now, one of the sonic branding tools that I think became quite well known globally, and people might remember this as we're talking, was the Intel Inside sonic branding, because there was a certain cadence to that which had, I think, to some degree, international appeal, but it became synonymous with Intel's chips. Now, Intel, they're in a very different situation now with their chips, and Nvidia are
Hmm.
riding high at the time of recording. But
Hmm.
some brands really use sonic branding well, don't they, Seats?
Yeah, so some have used it, and obviously Intel is a good example. The Saddam from Netflix is a great example that everyone knows. McDonald's pa is also a great example, and that's been used all across the world in all their communication, pretty much all of the time. And some of these sound logos obviously are good to work across the globe, but that's just the sound logo, and which is only the tip of the iceberg when you're talking about sonic branding. It's a recognizable 3 second logo basically in sound, but it's not what sonic branding is all about when you're talking about the array of possibilities that it offers. When you're talking about communication, when you're talking about touch points, all of these touch points where you use sound and voice should be thought about when you're talking about sonic branding. And the tip of the iceberg basically is the sound logo. That said, when you're talking about Intel, the thing, that sound, that was just a sound logo. I can't remember that they've actually had a Sonic brand identity. So they had a sound logo, but when it comes to their commercial the commercial films that Intel had, I don't think there was a strategic use of music and sound behind that. It was just a sound logo. And that's to say with a lot of brands, they have that sound logo, but they don't use sound and music strategically in all of their touch points. So there's still a lot of work for brands that have a sound logo when you're talking about sonic branding.
That's a really good point across their touch points,
Yeah.
rather than just that Intel example that we were just talking about. And when you're talking to companies about this topic,
Mhm.
I'm imagining it's very complex because we've kind of got that local versus global backdrop and who are their audience, etc., and who are they trying to reach. But then you've got the product or the service, and then you've got the board and whether they think it fits in and does it fit with who they are culturally, what's their brand values and ethos. So is it
Mhm.
as complex as I think it is when you're trying to talk to companies, or am I overcomplicating this, Seats?
It is actually, I think that's also the reason why a lot of companies have trouble touching sonic branding. The affinity with visual, with the color, with the font is far less than with music and sound. So also the opinions about music and sound are far bigger and far more apart within a company when you're talking about sonic branding. Not only that, but also when you're talking about touch points, we've got the help desk, we've got the commercial and the advertising films, you've got social media, you've got events, that kind of stuff. So all of these different touch points are led usually by different managers. And when you're talking about sound and branding, not every big company has a head of brand. They usually have a CMO, and they have a branding agency or a branding company working for them, but a head of brand and branding in particular is not always the case. So that person should be responsible for all of those touch points when it comes to music, but they also need to work together with all of the heads of those departments. And that's where sometimes it becomes difficult, because then you get a lot of opinions about, I don't think that this is the sound of the event or the brand. And then you need to go back to what we do when we start this process to the core brand values and how do these brand values translate to music and sound. And when you do that exercise, all of a sudden you get people on board.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to have to raise the words artificial intelligence because
Yes.
it's impacted everything. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure the world of sonic branding and music and, all those touch points that you're discussing is no exception. So how is AI changing things in your world? What are brands looking at? Is this a huge help? What's happening in the AI side of things?
I think AI is a great tool when you want to find out which brand values work to what extent in types of music. So it can be of great help when you're talking about getting to know your target audience, getting to know what culture drives which music. So it's a help to what we do, I think, rather than a threat to what we do. When it comes to creating what we do, it's still not there. I'm sure over the next 10, 15 years, there will be tools like ChatGPT that you can input what you need and it will give you a musical output. But nowadays, for the commercial use, the affinity with music is not big enough. You need to, like, it's machine learning after all. So this machine learning needs to be a lot further than where it is right now to be as good as humans at the moment. So I think it's a great help in finding your target audience. What does that target audience like? What does how do certain brand values translate to what instrument, for instance, a feeling, an emotion? I think that's where AI can help a lot, but not to the extent of actually making it. I think that's still a very human job at the moment. Obviously, for little things as translating a certain type of music into a more Asian sounding type of music, that's where it can help as well. Or that's where it can help instead of having to completely reproduce it. So I think AI is a great tool to help what we do. It's not a great tool yet, I have to say, to replace what we do.
That's fascinating because it sounds as though at the moment in the sonic branding world, if I can use that phrase, it's more of a research assistant, quite a smart one, obviously,
Yeah,
that's helping you build the sort of building blocks. But you very much need the human experts, the sound engineers, the people that understand to some degree those cultural aspects as well to put it all together. But I thought what
exactly.
was also interesting, you're saying that AI to some degree can help with the sort of reformatting is probably the wrong word, but that sort of translation, I suppose, from, well, this is kind of where we're at, but we need it to appeal maybe a little bit over here. So adjust it slightly, but keep the same brand essence, the same feelings, the same emotions in the music and the tone. Am
Yeah.
I right in saying that, Seats?
Yes, exactly. I think that's there are tools finding their way right now that will be able. I don't think they'll be able to do exactly what humans would do at the moment in terms of making it culturally relevant and stick with that audience. But there are tools that can point us in the right direction, and they will definitely point us in the right direction in terms of adding instrumentation that is relevant for that culture or for that part of the world. So that's where it can help. I wouldn't say it can replace everything we do yet. So But like I said, it will be possible in 10, 15 years, maybe longer, maybe a little bit shorter. I don't know yet. There's a lot of things happening. There's also a lot of companies trying to provide sonic branding with AI tools. Whereas I think if you've got a large company with a lot of brand values, a lot of history, all of that ticking in and creating what we do is still a very human work.
Yeah, and my own experience in this world is they were typically large organizations. They were listed on, global markets, PLCs, and a number of situations, big global brand presences. And they really put a lot of time and effort into this. And I've got a couple of questions for you on that. Is sonic branding being utilized by small, medium, and large organizations today? Is it still in the high end because of the costs involved? Is that changing? And why aren't companies using this? What sounds to me like a no-brainer. It's something that all companies should be considering from a global brand recognition perspective to connect with
Mm-hmm.
other humans and customers.
Yeah.
So, you know, who's the target audience for it? And why aren't we seeing more people take this up? Is it just the big brands, or have I got that wrong?
No, there's a lot of local brands also that Sonic Minds works for. DSB, the local train company in Denmark, obviously has been completely branded with sound by Sonic Minds. So that's local, and also smaller companies. The big companies tend to think about it more and quicker, but still also have the problem of how do I start? Where do I start? Who do I talk to? There's quite a lot of agencies that do this, but there's also not a lot of agencies that can handle these big brands with a network around the globe to provide for that. So I'd say you've got small companies that do it. Budget wise, those will be done by smaller sonic branding agencies that have fewer than 5 people probably, and the big ones will be done by the larger sonic branding agencies like we are, like CGM Soul in France, like Massive Music's, like I said, Sonic Minds. There's the big ones. So it really depends. It depends also on the needs of a brand. Do they want to have an audio logo and a brand track that they use in their events or in some of their big videos? Or do they actually want to roll it out in every touch point that they have, from their app to their event to their conference speaking opportunities to the help desk, maybe retail even? So there's a lot of big brands obviously have a lot more touch points, so then it becomes a lot bigger job. But there's also a lot of small brands that have a lot of that are in touch with their consumers a lot. So when you are in touch through video, through social media with your consumers a lot, it makes sense to think about your sound, to think about your brand sound. How do I sound, and what emotional connection do I want to create with music? So it could be small, could be big. It really depends on what you want to accomplish with it.
Now, in the world of getting a company to change its brand or to refresh its brand or to adjust its brand, now maybe that's through international expansion, maybe it's just that they've been around a long time and they want to refresh things and, appeal to a slightly different audience, for lots of different reasons. But when it comes to the sonic branding, that music track, that sort of logo, the audio sort of logo elements of it, do they tend to last for a number of years? Do they last for a long time, a short time? Because I'm just thinking of today's consumers as you were talking there. The rate of change is just ferocious. So
Mhm.
are you finding that some brands maybe that you've done some of this work for in the past that you've had to go back and revisit it because they need it to be changed again? Or how does that work in your world?
I think it's similar to visual branding. You can't change that every 3, 4, 5 years. You wanna keep that for quite a long time. Also to get that recognition, to get the recall, to create that emotional connection. Obviously, with music, it might be that it changes a little bit quicker over time than the visual identity. So in that perspective, we can adapt to that. But I'd say sound logos, like the ones that we just discussed, from Intel to Netflix to Microsoft to McDonald's, they've been around for at least 20 years, I think. So that's why they're so powerful, because they are ingrained in our memories because of the use for so long. And that's what you should do when you're talking about sonic branding, is don't change the complete brand identity every 3-4 years. Keep it on a path and try to alter it along the way with little changes, but at least stay true to the brand values in terms of sound and music.
Yeah, and I suppose us humans, outside of AI, we have that brand recall, don't we? We've heard that repetitive message. It's kind of in there at a subconscious level at this stage. So the
Yeah.
brand recall, the brand association is strong.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, as we're coming towards the end of our time together today, Seats, but we've touched on, what is sonic branding. We've talked about AI's impacts. We've talked about why companies aren't using it and the type of companies that are using it. But what does success look like? If you were going out to a new company today and you were speaking to them, what are some of the building blocks or the processes that a company has to go through to end up with a successful set of tools that they can use across their brand, across their company?
First, we start with the first questions we do with a brand is we go back to the drawing board. What are the brand values of a brand? And that's already to translate those to music and sound is already quite a process. It'll take a couple of weeks, and also we need to clear up agendas for quite a few people within the company that are involved in music and sound when it comes to touch points of the brand. So to create a successful sonic ID, that's where it starts. The beginning, we need to draw that out basically in terms of brand values, sound, emotion. And once we've done that successfully, we start iterating on a couple directions of where we think that translates to. And once we've done that, we'll take it to brand songs. That means sound or that means music that a brand can use in their communication, which is advertising, which is conferences, which is events, which is help desk, the waiting music on a help desk, for instance. So to make that successful, we need to take these steps with the brand. It's not something that we get the assignment and then after we get the assignment, we'll deliver everything to you. It's something we do together with the people at a brand. And usually it's the marketing managers, the brand managers, the people that are maybe in products, because we also deliver sounds for products. But to do that successfully, it's a tedious process of quite a few meetings, not too many meetings, obviously, but quite a few meetings to find out how we can translate that brand essence, the brand values very well into sound so that it can use in all those touch points. And all in all, I'd say that process could take from 10, 12 weeks to half a year, sometimes even a year, to do it very, very well when it's got to do with all the touch points of a brand. So that's something that takes time, just as creating a visual identity takes time. And it's a tedious process of finding out how to translate a certain emotion, a certain brand value into what sound specifically. And once we've done that, obviously, then we take it to the next step, and only then it will be a success. And obviously, another big thing is also testing. So once we have found a direction of sound, a direction of sound logo, of brand track, for instance, we can test that pre-going live. And we can test that against a panel of target audience of the brand. And once we find out that a certain direction works better than the other direction, we can safely say that that's a better way to go than the other one. So the testing is very much important, I'd say. Also after the fact, not only pre-going live, but also after 6 months or after a year. Once it's landed with the target consumer, target audience, it makes sense to do testing after a while. I'd say testing makes a lot more sense after more than a year, because it takes time for consumers and business partners to recognize it, to get it ingrained in your memories, and to connect it to a brand. So that takes time. But testing is a very important part of the success as well.
I really like that. And thank you for connecting the dots for me for the brand values, obviously setting everything up. and then
Yeah.
you're moving on to the sound elements, and then onto emotion, and then testing being critical as well to make sure that it's
Exactly.
doing what you set out to do from the start. So
Yeah.
thank you for joining those dots, Seats. That's great.
You're welcome.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to maybe share with our worldwide audience? Any parting thoughts? Anything you'd like to add?
I'd say that one of the critical things that brands should ask today in a world where obviously visual is still very much the number one when it comes to communication. Think about how you sound and what you sound like in those touch points. Once you realize that it's complete, like you're unrecognizable with sound, you might want to consider a sonic identity.
Well, that brings us
That's my
nicely.
final, yeah, that's
Yeah,
my
no, I was
final
going to
thought.
say it brings us nicely to the end of our discussion. Thanks so much for being
Thank
on the
you.
show today. I want to thank everybody who is watching or listening to this episode of Vista Talks, and I'm going to invite people to join me back for some more interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world, just like Seats. But thank you very much for being a guest on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Simon, for having me, and curious to see and hear it. Thank you so much.